Well, good morning, almost good afternoon, and thank you all for staying till the very end of this Roush's conference, which was as wonderful as ever, probably even more so this year than ever. It's quite an extraordinary privilege to be a part of the Milken universe, and I'm personally thankful for that. My name is Howard Soule. I'm the Chief Science Officer of the Prostate Cancer Foundation, and I've been with Mike for 20 years, so this is my 20th global conference. It's really great to be here. I'll introduce the panel in just a second. Cancer is a horrible disease, but we're going to take a glass half full approach to our discussion and dialogue today with people from a vast and diverse experience in this area, and we're going to look towards the future and how we might all make a bigger impact in solving the problem. So if I could have slide 1 just for the serious stuff first. You know, while we're sitting here today, there'll be 198, just for the hour, 198 new diagnoses of cancer. That's 198 families in the United States. You can do the math. 70 people will die while we're sitting here today. Very, very serious. And I think most of us have been touched by cancer in our family, our friends, in our community, and it is a daunting problem, but we are making progress. It's huge. And it costs a lot of money. Since this is the Milken Institute Global Conference, we can't go without saying that it's a tremendously expensive burden on our communities, on our families, and on many, many individuals. I'll introduce briefly this stellar group of people that have agreed to stick it out to the last day. Rajiv Kaul at the end. Rajiv has worked also for 20 years as the head of the Fidelity Select Biotech portfolio and the advisor biotech funds. These are the largest biotechnology investment funds in the world, if I'm not mistaken. And he's a great friend to the Milken Institute and to the Prostate Cancer Foundation, are all of these people, et cetera. Dr. Freda Lewis-Hall, how many panels have you been on this year?
Oh, I stopped counting on day 3.
She stopped counting. This amazing person is the chief medical officer at that little drug company in New York called Pfizer. Which is an absolutely awesome responsibility. I'm in total awe of you all the time, and I covet the time that we've had and will have in the future as our foundation works more closely with Pfizer Oncology to solve the problem for everybody. But you've also had a lot of experience in other drug companies. We won't say all of their names. There are too many, but they're big, medium, and small. And what Dr. Lewis-Hall, one of the things that is most important, in my opinion, in her career, early in her career, was that she studied healthcare disparities. Why do some groups of human beings, and I guess that was in the mental health field at the time, but it's cancer, it's heart disease, it's diabetes, it's all major human diseases. Why do certain groups of people get affected more than others? So we're going to call on you on that topic. David Reese, to my left, is also an old friend. Gosh, David, we go all the way back to your fellowship at UC San Francisco. David has a position of huge responsibility at Amgen, just down the road from here. He heads up the translational and early development of new therapies in the cancer arena. And you do it very, very well. Amgen is very important to the field. And to my far left, Mark Simon. Mark is also a bit of a legend in the biotech investment field. Has funded, I don't know how many tens of billions of dollars of companies at Robertson Stevens in the early days of your career, at Citibank, and now at Torreya Partners, where Mark acts as a consultant to just dozens of small, medium, and large companies. There's nothing I know that Mark doesn't already know, so that's why he's here on the panel today. So thank you all for joining us. So there's one word in society that we probably overuse. It's the word innovation. And if we're going to solve the cancer problem, we have to be more innovative. We have to do things differently than have been done in the last 20 or 30 years. Yes, we have made progress. Yes, there are immunotherapies, but the process of getting a drug from the laboratory into patients is still an earth-shatteringly complicated, expensive, and time-consuming problem. So I'd like to start out with Rajiv, because you manage companies, the progress of companies, the capitalization of companies, and all the investors that provide the resources to do that. From your perspective in biotech, what do you see are the issues related to innovation?
Thanks a lot, Howard, for having us here, and for all your great work with PCF. I think I would say there's three predominant forces in my head when I think about what's going on in this field. The first is I'm genuinely very excited about where the science is. You've had this incredible growth in technology that's allowed costs to come down for interrogation, the tools that we have to really understand human biology in a very deep and precise level. And the excitement there for delivering new drugs safely to selective patients, engineering the body's own immune system, engineering T cells, antibodies, dual antibodies, armed antibodies, small molecules, reprogramming people's genes, re-engineering RNA, fixing proteins. I think there's real hope, and the science has never been better. And I think if you look at the explosion in science in the last 20 years, as a result of so many great forces coming together in the world, and particularly in the United States, we spend $40 billion a year in the United States on NIH funding today. It's unfortunately been flat-ish, growing again in the last two administrations. But 50 years ago, when JFK was president, that number was 300 million. This is exponential growth. It's doubled under every administration. And so we're all really benefiting from that. And I think that's really leading to this incredible period of innovation. So I think that's really positive for investors. And I think I have a lot of really, really good ideas. Now, I say this with caution. You want to follow the science and you really want to follow the data. As an investor, you're going to lose a lot of money if you pick the wrong companies, and most of these companies will not work. So you have to make a distinction between investing in great stocks and great companies that can really transform lives and come up with breakthrough medicines versus just getting excited about the hope and the science. And it's a field, because it's so fundamental to human life, the hope factor is always very high. But the fundamental science has never been better. My frustration is based on which is the second point, which is based on what you said earlier. 78 people are going to die during the course of this talk. 600,000 Americans die from cancer every year. That's the city of Boston. That's the entire population of the city of Boston. Not the greater Boston area, but the city of Boston. We lose that every year. And so the cost that we pay as a society is incredibly high. And I think distinct from the amount of attention as a culture and a society that's paid to fixing this problem, despite the great promise of where the science is today. So that is my frustration. I'd like to see a lot more and a lot faster. And the third thing is my concern. My concern is around public perception around cost, real concerns around the burden to payers, real concerns around families that are diagnosed with this terrible disease, strikes from nowhere in most cases, and then they have to go mortgage their house to pay for these drugs. That's a really terrible situation. And I don't know what the solution there is, but that's my concern. And my hope is that, as we're a great society in the context of the world, and we'll find a solution for this major problem. Yes. A way to find ways to pay for it. And the Europeans will, in other parts of the world, people will find a way to pay for these life-saving drugs, and we'll have a healthy debate around it. But today the concern is that people are happy to pay $5 a day for a cup of Starbucks coffee, but they won't pay the same for often a life-saving drug. Yes. So let me stop at that.
Thank you. There's a statistic that that was pulled up for me. I mean, a patient with cancer is 2.5 times more likely to file for bankruptcy 1 year after diagnosis than a person in the general population. And we're not putting that on the companies. It's the whole ecosystem of taking care of patients, from the doctor's office to the hospitals to pharma that needs money to innovate. You know, it's just very, very complicated. So, Dr. Reese, as a physician scientist at one of the premier biotechnology firms in the world that has really improved the lives of patients with cancer and kidney disease and many other human disorders, from where you sit as a leader of translational and early clinical discovery and development, where do you see innovation coming from in your hands?
Well, thanks, Howard. You know, I'd like to pick up in part on what Rajiv said. Clearly, it has never been more exciting from a scientific perspective. You know, I've been doing this for a long time now. You know, what we're doing now compared to what we did 20 years ago when I was in training is almost unimaginable. And if you think at a very high level where we are headed, we are seeing the marriage of two big strands. One is what we now call precision medicine, or here precision oncology, which is understanding the wiring, the alterations in a cancer cell and its environment, and trying to specifically target those with immuno-oncology, really harnessing the power of the patient's immune system as an anti-cancer agent. And so, to me, the excitement is trying to put all that together. Now, the challenge, of course, is that with this deeper understanding we've generated has been an understanding that the system is incredibly complex. And there are a very large number of variables. So from where I sit, the challenge is, how do you figure out quickly which medicines have the most promise? And just as importantly, who are the patients that will benefit and who are the patients that won't benefit, and how can we identify them very rapidly so that we can then really deliver precision medicine, which is simply getting the right drug to the right patient. So those are the sort of high order, that's the high order promise and the high order challenge from my point of view.
Absolutely. So I probably know 0.001% of the staff at your company. It's so gigantic that it's daunting. It's probably even daunting to you.
At times, for sure.
At times. And yet, Pfizer has led the industry in many innovative areas, especially in cardiovascular disease with Lipitor and many, many other medications. How do you manage innovation in a behemoth organization? How do you keep the fire and the creative juices going when it's just so big?
Well, I think the fire and the creative juices really come out of the people who come into work every day, and what they really want to do is to save or change people's lives and create a healthier world. So it really starts with, I mean, you can't, it's hard to kind of pierce that notion when you think of, 99,000 people all around the world. Our size and scale and scope is, of course, tremendous, but the fire really comes at the point of, well, what we refer to as service, so what we do every day. Mm-hmm. And I think the other, the way I translate some of the things that we're doing to advance, even though it's really complex, as we've just talked about, is in 3 buckets. And we've attacked it in those 3 buckets, kinda. So the first bucket is how we know what we need to know. The second is how we know what we know, kind of how you go about kind of learning that. And then the third is how we apply what we know. Mm-hmm. So if you think about the first bucket, the question is, if you really want to change people's lives and save people's lives, why don't you ask them about it? So we've really kind of engineered a part of our innovation around patient focus. And I'd love, as we proceed, to talk a little bit about the mechanisms, the actual tangible things that we've done and what that impact has been. Mm-hmm. But it really is, what do you do How do you engage patients fully or integrate them and partner with them so you really understand what they need, how they need it. And the second thing is how we know what we know. We have got to fix the drug development process. I mean, we just have to. It is, slow, expensive, inflexible, in many cases backwards. I'm like, really, y'all? And so I should have a sign in my office because I say it all the time, really? So, the question is, how are we going to do that? And we've got great examples of how this is coming, things that Pfizer is doing using artificial intelligence to do a better job of patient identification, doing adaptive trials, basket trials, a whole host of things that we think, at least incrementally, are going to begin to shape-shift the space that we're working in, especially in oncology. And then last but not least, and this is our collective problem, but we try and think about it as we work, and that is how we're going to apply what we now know. So the distance between having a life-saving, life-changing medicine and actually getting it to some patients, most patients, and all patients is this long, arduous road. And some of you are going to hear me repeat myself, but what I say is we are delivering Star Wars medicines into the Flintstones healthcare system. And so that is the third piece of how we need to help transform the road from remarkable scientific discovery to making sure that we've touched everybody everywhere with it.
So here's a real world example of frustration with clinical trials. So we had a dinner, we had our foundation board meeting on Sunday. Some of you were there and at the dinner. And the dinner speaker was Mr. Mack, who has this really intelligent program at Columbia University working with a psychiatrist. It's equine wellness for post-traumatic stress disordered veterans. And they interact with horses, and apparently on a randomized clinical trial to help them with their PTSD. So the psychiatrist is talking about the protocol, and she says, well, it's an 8-week protocol. But they like it so much, they really want to stay on, but it's an 8-week protocol. And one of our major donors in the room stood up and said, this is crazy. If they want to go 10 weeks or 12 weeks, let them do it. She said, well, we can't do that because of the protocol, the clinical trial protocol. We did this research. If we made it 8 weeks, they would enter. If we made it 12 weeks, they wouldn't, so we cut it off. I mean, this guy was frustrated. Not as frustrated as we are, though.
Right.
So that's a real world example. So Mark, you do a lot of interesting things, but probably the most interesting thing that I know that you do from being your friend and colleague for all these years is you help small companies with great ideas find sunshine, or you euthanize them when it's necessary to perform euthanasia. So tell us a little bit about how you pick and choose, because your time is as precious as any of the rest of us. How do you prioritize who you're going to work with and who you're not?
I mean, it comes down to what Mike Milken says, intellectual capital. And it comes down to the teams and obviously what their track record is. The science is moving so quickly that even though we have PhDs at the firm, one of the first questions we ask is which academics, which KOLs are you working with? And how heavy is your involvement, and have the experiments been replicated? Because as you know, there's a lot of publications that, I think Amgen, you guys, one of your employees said this, 85% of the academic experiments that are published are not duplicated. So there's a major challenge there. So it's a lot of filtration, but in the end, you try to rely, I've been doing this for 30 plus years, and I'm not a drug hunter, but there are some people who can look at pieces of data, can look at the preclinical, can look at the science, and maybe look at the phase 1 and kind of give that feel. They kind of have that intuition. And there's probably only maybe 30 or 50 people, who I think can really do that. But some of them are involved with PCF, and I have a lot of respect for them, and their track record is perfect, like Bill Nelson, in terms of abiraterone. He did some Herculean work there in terms of, what happened with J&J. So ultimately, it's the team, but when these companies come in, it's so raw. There's no such thing as perfect data. If they had perfect data, they wouldn't come in to see us. There wouldn't be a stock market. So in the end, it's intuition, but it's a lot of confirmation. And then as a former research analyst, we track them. So the famous milestones. You always ask, what are your goals over the next 6 or 12 months? They come back in 6 or 12 months. You look at the checklist, and you find out if they executed or if they didn't execute. The other thing that we search for is humility. If a CEO comes in and says, oh, I know toxicology, I know scale-up, I know CMC, I know clinicals, I know reimbursement, you head for the hills. It's ultimately, what is their level of ignorance? And do they understand how ignorant they are? And if they have humility, that's actually a great skill. And usually we like to see if they failed before. So I always find that if you fail a couple of times and then succeed, you've learned from the failures. There are some people who fail multiple times who never learn.
Can you give an example of a small private concern that you consider exceptionally innovative?
Yeah, there's a German company called Phoenix. It's focused on NASH in Germany. They have excellent chemistry against a target called FXR.
You'll have to explain NASH to this audience.
Okay. NASH is a disease of fatty liver. So in other words, patients who have bad diets ultimately get can get fat in their livers, and it could lead to liver damage and cirrhosis. So it's a major issue with obesity and high cholesterol. It's non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. I think that's the technical definition. And it's probably 10 to 20 million people, and so it's a primary care situation. It's not 1,000 patients, around the world. And the company came to us, and they had really excellent chemistry. They had lined up, it's a German company, they had lined up a lot of their advisors in Germany. Their first preclinical candidate failed. They went through a deep dive why that failed. It looked to us like they learned from that mistake, and they applied some of those lessons. So we ended up engaging with them, and about a year and a half, it took a long time, Gilead did a deal for about $500 million with this company. And Gilead has come, with its hepatitis C franchise, has a terrific intellectual capital understanding of this area. But I also will say that before we went out to Gilead, we probably spent 3 to 6 months lining up the story, finishing experiments, thinking about how we were going to package it. And the other thing that we did that we always like that I think is important is we put down what we don't know. So we actually told Gilead what can go wrong, because they're going to find it anyway. Their experts are going to absolutely find out all the risks. So you might as well inoculate, and you might as well be upfront about them. And the company was very humble, and again, it's been very successful so far.
I'll give you an example recently in the oncology space. Juno got acquired this year for $9 billion. Celgene just bought it. In the summer of 2016, their first generation JCAR15 was put on clinical hold by the FDA because unfortunately 2 patients died because the cell expansion occurred faster than they were expecting, and it created a super immune response. That's an example of a really innovative drug. Today, the data suggests that 40% of patients that take this one-time treatment with an engineered T cell, that's the soldier of the immune system, have very durable responses. We'd like to think the longer-term data from the NCI suggests that these patients have cures. But the company went back, they figured out the problem, they changed the regimen they were using, they re-engineered the molecule, and they made progress. And I think Mark's point around failure is an important point because we are treading on unknown science, and translating science into drugs is a really hazardous, risky process, and it comes with failure. The question really is, do you have the right management team? Do you have the capital? Do you have the vision? Do you have the insight to fix the problems? And this is an example where this company was successfully able to fix the problem, and it was a good return for investors and a good outcome for patients.
Rajiv, to your point, they came from Dendreon. So the
That's
Juno executives.
That's a good point, yeah.
Juno executives had left Dendreon, a company that had success going through the FDA, but significant.
Sort of.
Sort of. It's controversial. They did get it approved, but they had a lot of mistakes along the way. So, as Rajiv said, Juno was able to make a rapid course correction, get it fixed, and then ultimately do a great deal with Celgene.
Yeah, I mean, it was a really serious side effect.
Right. I mean, the stock tanked, and everyone not sure about the future of the company at the moment in time. But I think it's testament to the depth of the management team, the experience there, and also where the science is and just how rapidly understanding of human biology is exploding.
Yes.
So that you can find causal variables, and then you can engineer solutions, and you can maybe do it in a much faster time period than you would have it in the past. And to your point, Freda, I think having an FDA that understands where the science is and understands the huge need is a huge benefit. I'd like to say Scott Gottlieb is doing a very good job. There's a lot more to be done. If the iPhone needed to get FDA approval every time they launched a new iPhone, I don't think it would be an iPhone 10, right? And if we needed the insurance companies to approve an app every time you download it to use it, we'd have a lot less apps on our phone. So that's that's the unfortunate situation within healthcare. But there's still lots of reasons to be very optimistic.
Yes.
I think, so again, I'm really encouraged about our ability to solve the scientific problems. I think that some of our opportunity really lies in the dynamics of the system. You need patients to help solve the problem, just as an example, to enroll in your clinical trials. And today, it is a fact that about 5% of patients actually enroll in clinical trials in oncology, and that's higher than it is in general, 5%. Now, everyone else doing everything else under all other circumstances are not involved in this incredible dynamic of trying to advance cures for everyone. So what could we do in order to change that dynamic? Now, if you ask me, I would say at the end of the day, what we want is every single patient interaction to be a research interaction, and we could harness the power of big data to help ask and answer important questions, not just on the science side, but also on connecting the dots for patients. So what would it take to get there? What are the barriers that stand between patients who are diagnosed, those 170 some odd patients that are diagnosed within this hour? What would it take to actually get them engaged in a system that had a complete set of data on them, that had all of that data aggregated in a way that we could query it in a meaningful way? What does that look like? And so you start to look at, what does stand between it. Of course, the data that we have available, the records that we collect and the way that we collect them is inconsistent, variable, doesn't integrate well, but that's a technical fix. The second thing is, we have done a lot of research in this. The second thing is physicians don't ask patients about participating in clinical trials. Many of them are not themselves investigators. They don't want to refer. There's an urgency in treatment, et cetera. And so we have an opportunity, I think, to evolve the system and the willingness for both patients and their physicians. I mean, literally, patients say, well, no, I would have done it. Nobody asked me. So we have an ask barrier. And then we have some practical barriers, like even if a patient wanted to participate in a clinical trial, how do you find one? How do you find one in your geography? And then the last one, which hurts my heart, is the idea that many times patients have been referred, are willing to participate in a clinical trial, are evaluated for their appropriateness for participating in the trial they were referred to, are oftentimes found not to be appropriate. They meet some exclusion criteria, and so they're lost, if you would, to the system. Yes. But there's some solutions that are being practiced. I wished Lou DeGeneiro was here to talk about some of the incredible work that is being done with the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society around AML, which is the most common adult leukemia. And essentially what it does is randomize patients to 9 arms. So it's essentially an all-comers study that allows people to be captured and kind of no person turned away. There's a similar study in lung cancer and squamous cell that is being run by a collaborative. The FDA is participating, as well as Friends of Cancer Research, the Foundation of the NIH, the NCI. So it's an all-hands-on-deck effort. And there are 5 companies that are participating, testing new therapies in this area. Patients, again, all comers, are randomized based on kind of a full sequencing and workup. And so I think these tests, if you would, of these new paradigms for research are getting good traction. We're seeing more and more in many different areas of research, and in particular in oncology. And I'll just add, I guess, an exclamation point on the importance of solving this. The immuno-oncology trials, if you look at the permutations across the tumor types, the stages, the potential combinations, are mind-boggling. And we would have to enroll every person in,
With cancer.
on the face of the earth in order to ever get through all of those permutations. So we have to take a step back and say, if we're honestly going to advance, leverage fully all of the scientific prowess that we have, we're going to have to find a better way to get patients involved.
So just to add to that, just a quick comment. In prostate cancer, in the worst kind of prostate cancer, we actually have one of those trials of all comers.
Yes.
It's not in this country, and it's called Stampede, and it's in the United Kingdom. In that whole horrible National Health Service where they make you go see this, it's really a good system. They collect all the data, they have all the companies lined up, and it's adaptive. If something isn't working, it gets euthanized. If something is working, it gets expanded into a large clinical trial. That was point one. Point two is the 5% accrual in the clinical trials is horrible. However, in the early 1950s, in Boston, on Binney Street, Sidney Farber, in the basement of an old hospital, figured out how to change the death rate from pediatric leukemia from almost 100% to about 10% today. And how did he do that? Every kid that came to what is now the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in Boston was on a clinical trial. And they still are, to this day. May
So
he
we know it
rest in
works.
peace. We know it works. We know it works.
So, a lot of these remarks bring to mind for me what I think are two of the existential challenges facing the entire ecosystem of drug development for cancer and most diseases. One is the failure rate. Now that we have to fix through science and better understanding of biology and improving the learning cycle, as Mark and others have pointed out. And the and the second is the cycle time. 7, 10, 12, perhaps more years from conception to late-stage clinical development or FDA approval is simply no longer acceptable. None of us can afford it. And so, the things Freda is describing really help us say, okay, how do we improve that cycle time? And one way is to get far more patients involved so that we learn more quickly and hopefully they benefit along the way.
Yes. So I want to change gears just a little bit here. And
I
you,
would just add one thing on
okay,
this
sure,
point, though.
sure.
Just around coming back to the glass being half full, your initial comment. These are all the challenges, but if you look at prostate cancer deaths, the last 20 years in the United States, they're down 50%. Breast cancer death rates are down 40%. Non-Hodgkin's lymphoma 20 years ago had a 3 to 5 year survival rate. Now it's 15 years, 20 years ongoing. Multiple myeloma is a great example of similar sort of trends. New curative therapies. At Sloan Kettering 20 years ago when I first visited them, there were 5 chemotherapies. Today there's 50 precision medicine driven drugs with selected populations. So the progress, there's real progress happening here.
Yes.
I mean, I'm just framing it in that way to reiterate your point that the glass is half full, but we can do much better.
We can.
Howard, in terms of just one quick thing to add to that, we haven't said it, there's also been a major revolution in diagnostics. We talk about therapeutics, curing disease, well, cell-free DNA, circulating tumor DNA, circulating tumor cells, next generation imaging, the PET scan imaging, exome sequencing. We've had an incredible explosion. And then the FDA did something last year that was Herculean. They approved Keytruda for MSI high patients just based on a mutation, ignored tumor location.
Yeah, so that was going to be my next point.
And just, I'll say one more, I'll riff off Mark there, one more thing for all the investors in the room. There is a real return as an investor in this space if you're able to, and to society, patients, payers, if you're able to get it right.
Yes.
Genentech's a great example of this. The company in 2000 had a $5 billion valuation, and they had 2 drugs, Rituxan and Herceptin, for HER2-positive breast cancer and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, that today are among the largest drugs in the world. 9 years later, Roche paid $100 billion for it. It was the #1 performing large-cap stock in the United States during that decade. That's the kind of incentive there is, I think, to investors to invest in this field, if you're right. I think that the art of this is in picking the right drugs and finding ways to get them through the clinic as fast as possible.
Okay. So I have 2 topics left. One is precision medicine, and the other one is our own responsibility as human beings to create a lifestyle that reduces risk. So let's talk about precision medicine first, because Mark brought it up. If I can translate what you said, there is a drug called Keytruda. It's one of these immunotherapy drugs you can't turn the TV on without learning something about it.
It's a foundational one.
It's a foundational medicine for melanoma, for lung cancer, for some lymphomas, and it's been a godsend for a certain group of people that we don't really know who they are, except in certain forms of cancer where there's this one genetic abnormality. So this is very common in colon cancer, but not so common in prostate cancer, not so common in breast cancer. And what the FDA allowed Merck to do was to apply a diagnostic test, as Mark stated, to find these patients. So it wasn't a lung cancer trial or a brain cancer trial or a melanoma trial. It was a cancer trial. Didn't matter where the cancer came from. And sure enough, they got approval in that setting. So we're going to talk a little bit about this daunting number of combination therapies and how we might use precision medicine. Right now, everybody is throwing, and this is not just industry, this is academia. Everyone is complicit here, throwing stuff against the wall in immunotherapy to see what will stick. And fortunately, we have bright people at the beginning of the game that are thinking about combinations more molecularly. And what are you doing with precision medicine to help design and implement better combination trials?
Well, so every program that we take into human trials, I mean, starting at least 2 years before the first human being will be dosed with that candidate drug, we are thinking about what is a potential diagnostic and really what is patient selection, broadly defined, meaning who is going to benefit from the drug, and just importantly, who won't, so that they're not wasting their time with that drug. And in fact, I'm in charge of okaying drugs to move into clinical development at Amgen, and one of the criteria is a well thought out plan for how we are going to optimize patient selection. We won't know everything. We may know a little, we may know a lot, depending on the disease. But what I want to see is the plan for how we're going to learn that in the early phases of development, so that again we can quickly converge on the right segment of patients. Now, as Mark pointed out, we have one huge aid right now, which is the rapid technological advance, our ability to sequence tumors, for example, very quickly, to examine the tumor microenvironment. In some of our studies, we're doing single cell profiling of the tumor and the tumor microenvironment to dissect what is going on at a molecular level so that we can understand how to apply these drugs. The question is, how do we actually routinize that and make it a standard approach? And there's a little way to go there, but I'm actually quite optimistic, given the pace of technologic change, that we will make problems that were even 5 years ago difficult to solve tractable.
Yes. I mean, I know clinics that won't accept a new drug from a sponsor unless there's a biomarker. And they'll collaborate to create that biomarker. Do you see this trend at your company as well?
Well, from a development standpoint, I think this is really important, but the point I want to tag on to that David made is sequencing and sophisticated diagnostics and precision medicine has not been democratized yet. So if you're fortunate enough to be at the Dana-Farber or to, MD Anderson or some of the incredible places where this science advances and clinical care advances every day, great. But if you end up in a community oncology environment or a community hospital, the likelihood of your accessing these tremendous advances begins to slim and is oftentimes none. And so I think that these opportunities on the high science end, we really have to figure out how to shorten the tail, if you would. Because again, I'm dealing on my vision, which is at some point, everybody is getting all of this characterization the moment they step into the door.
Yes.
And they get the benefit, therefore, of the clinical outcomes that they could be provided by these new advances. And collectively, we get the benefit of being able to better understand, generate, and test hypotheses and then connect the dots for them. So I don't mean to get stuck on that point, but I want to make sure that we're connecting to, and I'll use the opportunity really quickly to say, and there's certain things that drive the disparities, and they're real. They're not just, kind of sad things. They determine outcomes in a very profound way. If I think of prostate cancer in African American men, increased likelihood of getting it, twice as likely to die from it. Even when there are corrections for socio-demographic data and information, we just don't know enough. And so I think we have a real opportunity as we begin to flex our scientific muscles and kind of change the dynamic of how we articulate our studies, to remember as we are analyzing the data that we're beginning to look at some of these especially vulnerable populations or ones with different outcomes, that we enhance our patient populations in study so that we can make sure that the people who are dramatically affected by these diseases get the benefit of all this work that we're doing. And I think we have ways to do all of that, and I'm excited for the work that's happening in the laboratory, in academic environments, at companies, and out in treatment environments around the country to really make a difference.
Yes. You touched on disparity a little bit. Could you say just a little bit more?
I can say a lot more.
I know.
But
we could have a 5-week course on it, but in a minute or so.
Yeah. Well, I think the thing that's I won't tell you how many decades ago when I was studying mental health disparities and doing so from Howard University in Washington, there were all of these hypotheses about everything being driven by social determinants. So education, socioeconomic level, a whole host of sociodemographics, but not the biology of the diseases. And what we're beginning to understand with precision medicine is, if you sequence breast cancers in African American women, for example, they are often differentiatable, I'm not even sure if that's a word, from other populations. The character of their cancer is potentially different. Again, we don't know enough, but there are these little glimpses of potential ways to track into better understanding disparities and to offer roads or pathways to closing these gaps. And I've actually started changing my language a little bit because I grew up in disparities, but I'd like to start thinking about equity. Yes. So I've started to think about this as kind of equitable understanding and equitable application of our scientific advances.
Thank you for
If
that.
I can just say one thing on Freda's point.
Sure.
So I've only gone to the FDA 3 times in my 33 years, so big mistake who took me to the FDA. But at one of the FDA meetings we were at, the FDA was talking about the REMS program, which is how will they make sure this program is targeted for the patients who will benefit, and how do you avoid the patients who could be harmed? So the FDA and the company were discussing this labeling, and it was going to be complicated, involve videos, a lot of signatures, a lot of monitoring. And someone at the FDA said to the sponsor, meaning the company, they said, let me ask you a question. If we do all these restrictions, will anybody at an inner city hospital, will they be able to fill out the 40 pages of paperwork? Do they have the staff to do it? Or is this just going to be a Beverly Hills drug? And the answer was the latter. So that there's a huge problem in that with a lot of these complicated drugs, the inner cities just don't have the staffing. So there's a huge access issue. And that was the one vignette I wanted to just tell you that just on the simple, the drug is available, it's out there, but filling out the paperwork and doing all the compliance stuff ends up being a major restriction to a very overburdened hospital.
And I'm sorry, because I
Go
want to
ahead.
do one more
Go
thing.
ahead.
So one of the other things, and I hate to, I sound like Debbie Downer, but one of the things that stands between us and practical application is actually just practical process. So if you think about lung cancer and our capacity now to sequence a number of mutations and treatments that are targeted to those mutations, we know that in more sophisticated academic and treatment centers, about 90% of the patients have sequencing applied to the clinical decision making. So what my treatment's going to be is determined by all of this sophisticated diagnostic that's done. But if you go out into the communities, about 10%. This was some years ago and it's much better now, thank goodness. But when we were looking at the barriers, we were thinking, well, why don't we just educate? You know, we just tell them it's a good thing. And they'll start doing it. So, you know, someone who was much wiser said, no, I don't think just telling them is going to work. Let's go in and actually do a process assessment of this to understand what stands in the way. So if you went to the oncologist, they said, you know, the report that you send is really useless. And, oh, by the way, it gets there very late. So we said, useless we can fix. What about late? Why does it take so long? So they said, well, you know, we don't do the biopsies, by the way. The pulmonologists do the biopsies,
Yes.
so maybe you should talk to them. And then we found out that the actual process, specifically the process in the OR, that the materials that they were using to collect the samples, to store the samples, to ship the samples, often were just not large enough to hold the size that would be required to do the full range of tests. So now, just simple changes. You know, they got delivered on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so if you had your biopsy on Thursday afternoon, it didn't get picked up till Tuesday, it took a week to run, and then a while to get the report back to the physician. These were easy fixes once you understood that those were the barriers. So I think that we have easy fixes, like to fix a REMS program by not having all of those barriers. That's not the kind of incredible science that we have to do to fix some of the other problems, but they're just practical. We just have to know that they need to be fixed and then just do it.
Yes.
Well, I mean, an additional point on this is prevention and diagnostics and prevention. Because I imagine a lot of people, I'm not sure what the screening rates are for men with prostate cancer in the United States, but I imagine they could be a lot higher. And I imagine that there's a lot of disparity.
Well, we were told that
yeah.
we shouldn't screen at all. And then we were told to
Right.
screen a little bit, but not exactly how. So there's a little confusion.
Right, and so that's the dilemma in that situation. I imagine in cervical cancer, it's a clearer test. The optimism, I would say, is that there's newer companies with newer technology that are making, using precision medicine and measuring circulating DNA. For example, Exact Sciences has a stool test that can be easily done and sent in the mail. 23andMe, I don't think they have a test today, but they're making genetics into a consumer product. I think that'll bring down the cost and improve accessibility in the population and across the world. So I think advances in some of these areas suggest that we can get around the bureaucracy of the healthcare system.
Yes. I mean,
And maybe get a global reach here too, because we lose 600,000 people in the United States from cancer every year. We use 7 million people around the world, and four out of the 7 million people are premature deaths, preventable deaths. Once again, it's the accessibility and reach with next generation technologies should be real reason for hope.
well, it is. I mean, considering the first human genome cost $3 billion to sequence and took how long? 10 years? Now it can be done in a couple of days. The actual cost is about $60,000, but that is coming down quickly. So it's all good. I want to just make one statement about prevention. Rajiv, I don't know if you've invested in any companies around lifestyle, healthcare. Maybe you have.
I'm very interested in all of them. Sometimes companies like Exact Sciences would be examples where we've done well. Foundation Medicine is another one.
Yeah, but I'm talking about the softer, diet, lifestyle, exercise, etc. So let me just take a second here to say, and Audrey's gonna, my staff knows my opinion of nutritional supplements real well, but we've all heard a rooster crow in the morning, and we've watched the sun come up. Therefore, the rooster must have made the sun come up. So today we read the New York Times and find out that supplementing selenium in our diet, supplementing vitamin D, vitamin E, calcium, vitamin C, you name it, fish oil. This is the greatest thing. It prevents heart disease, it prevents cancer. It doesn't prevent anything. None of them work. They've all been shown to be ineffective once they're subjected to the same kinds of clinical trials that these two people have to do in their companies. We do think that there's a link with diet, and we do think that there's a link with exercise. And my friend Joe Boystack in the front row there sees me at our gym, Equinox, over in Marina Del Rey. I dare any of you to come and work out with us. It's really great. But I think those are a couple of the things that you can do for yourself. While the science is very complicated, we're trying to catch up. We're trying to understand what to tell people to do in their own lives to reduce their risk of cancer. And I don't know if maybe somebody else knows your practice. You still practice medicine, actually. I know that. What do you tell your patients about lifestyle?
Well, if you, to not get cancer, pick your parents wisely, if you can. Do not use tobacco products in any form. That's the single greatest public health, intervention that can be made. There's clearly an accumulating body of evidence around exercise, and then the nutritional realm is, as you said, very complicated. We know from the sheer basic epidemiology of cancer around the world that nutrition and environmental influences are important because the patterns of cancer are different. Certain cancers can vary dramatically. So, right now I think being sensible, doing more or less what your mother told you to do is, the best approach. Don't smoke, drink in moderation, and exercise.
And a colonoscopy.
And those medical
and pursue the
interventions.
basic, preventive,
Medical care.
My
interventions.
father's a retired GI, and he just couldn't believe how many people at
or
the age of
diagnostics.
60, whose parents died of colon cancer, never got a colonoscopy.
Yeah, you have to get it. You have to do it.
Keep the telomeres long on the white blood cells, the leukocyte. Elizabeth Brackmore had a great chart yesterday. I don't know if people saw it or not, but it's worth looking at that. There's a high correlation between premature mortality and premature death and life expectancy for people that are able to preserve the longevity of the telomeric length in leukocytes. Probably stress related as well.
Yes.
So my father
In
will
addition to
be,
diet and exercise.
my father's going to be 100 on September
Oh,
the 15th.
bless his heart.
So I'm going with the genetic theory here. Knock wood. But
Yeah.
I also wanted to add that this is, it's also what patients want to know. So we've engaged patients a lot, as have many. We've tried to accumulate some of the learnings from our interfaces, as practical as going over the materials that we are using in a clinical trial, looking at protocols, telling us what endpoints are actually of importance to them. But there was a study, the Macmillan study, on cancers and asking what patients wanted to know, what they wanted us to research, so that kind of what they wanted us to know. The number one was to research more information about how cancer was going to affect their lives, how they were going to live with it, down to things like, am I going to be able to drive? Am I going to be able to travel to see my I mean, they were asking very basic, very simple questions to which we often do not have the answers.
How long will I live?
Yeah, actually, that was not at the top of their to-do list. It was a lot about how am I going to live with it, right, as opposed to the longevity question. And the number 2 question was this: what are the risk factors? What are the causes? What are the prevention? So they were really focused on what, and is there something I can do to kind of stay at my best moving forward? And new therapies was number 7. So, you know, they were really thinking now. One of my patients many years ago taught me one of the best lessons ever. I was quoting data and statistics, you know, well, and the likelihood of you having one of these events is about 3%. It was about 3%. I sounded very, very smart and very officious. She patted me on the hand. She said, "Sweetie, if it happens to me, it's 100%.
Yeah.
So I've kept to that perspective. And it's helped to kind of think about what patients really need and want.
Yeah, no, I love what you're saying. It just reminded me of a recent study I read at Harvard University. It's one of the few longitudinal population studies. It's very hard to do longitudinal population studies with depth because you know they've studied a student population from the 1930s and followed them, and they're following their children through their lives. And the number 1 correlation with longevity was meaningful relationships, more than statins. And not in a traditional way. It was not people having traditional wives and children. They could have gone through, but having a meaningful relationships, was the highest correlate with longevity and health.
Well, we have time for like one question. If anybody would like to ask, no investment advice and no medical advice, but sure.
Well, I'm one of those local physicians that you were talking about, and I'm perfectly happy to talk to my patients about clinical trials. But I find that when I try to go find the clinical trials, if I have to, it's a tremendous burden on time and information to find the appropriate trial. Now, right here in Los Angeles, we have both USC and UCLA, which are designated national cancer centers. Is there some way to get a person in one of those cancer centers that I can either call or send the patient to, or who would know what's going on at Sloan Kettering and MD Anderson?
Call me.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, we follow the clinical trials everywhere, and I'd be glad to talk to you about that. But this is a process problem too.
It is. It's a huge problem. Of course, there's clinicaltrials.gov, which lists. It's sometimes hard to navigate, but kind of once you're in it for a little while, it gets easier. And then there's Find a Trial. Pfizer has a Find a Trial site, as you will find many companies do. From an oncology portfolio standpoint, often if you kind of know who's working in a specific area, we post our trials in a way that we think is easy to find and actually can refer patients actively into them once you get onto that site.
But it requires a physician to interpret what the best trial is.
Yeah.
If the patient's left to clinicaltrials.gov, they'll probably go through the first three pages and go for a walk or something.
And
Although
even at that, I'm an internist, and while I'm somewhat knowledgeable about what's going on, if I get a stage 4 patient with ENT cancer, for me to try and find the right place is very difficult. So.
Call me next week. I'd like to talk to you about this. That's a really interesting perspective.
problem solving, that would be great.
Yeah. There was one other hand up, I think. Please.
I just want to kind of bridge this last statement here to figure out. I'm Wayne Jonas from Samuel L. Foundation. How do we get investment in the love part? Okay, how can we get this guy over here to say, I'm going to put $200 billion into making sure love gets scaled in those areas if it's one of the biggest predictors for longevity?
Mark is very wealthy. He could do that.
I'm broke. Can we patent that in some way and create some FDA drivers that move it over there?
I mean,
are there
yeah.
some policy issues? So your question is, are there some policy changes that are needed to address the multiple challenges that you all have expressed here, which are pretty daunting?
Social science.
To deliver.
Well, there are multiple dimensions of what we call wellness now, and of course many companies have programs in wellness. How do we actually broaden that definition to encompass many other social aspects that have been neglected to date?
We also in America, a lot of people say the problem is not the system, It's the people and their behavior in the system. So we have much higher costs because behavior in this country, granted behavior in this room in Beverly Hills is fantastic, but you travel 20 miles away, behavior is in the abyss. Really bad decisions. Yes, exactly.
But I think there's a corner turn. If you asked me 25, 30 years ago whether or not someone would be talking about the impact of relationships on health outcomes, you know, I was training in psychiatry, so yeah, I got that. But, you know, there was a lot of eye rolling when you said that outside of the rooms that I was in. But now I think there's an acknowledgement, there's very intense science around it. There are studies around, you know, how you can actually create this impact. The Blue Zone studies around longevity are showing that it's not just a key part in doing better in certain diseases, but long lives. So I think that we are beginning to invest in the research that will tell us, okay, now what will we do with that? And, you know, again, I think as we apply it to the work that we do, it also comes out in endpoints. Patients are telling us, please don't just study progression-free survival and you know, whether or not I live or die in this study. Can you study and report out the quality of my life as a result of this intervention, the quality of the relationships I'm able to keep alive during all these things that I have to do to stay alive? You know, these are all things that we are paying attention to in our research as we advance treatments, but also in research that I think will come together.
Great
Getting there.
point. I think we are out of time. So I thank the panelists very much. Thank you all. And thank you.